Okay, I'd like to continue today picking up where we left off in the last module. So last time we were talking about members of the domain Eubacteria and taking specific examples from the Yellowstone ecosystem. And like I said, I'd like to continue that now. So as we look at the domain Eubacteria, again, keeping in mind that what distinguishes them from the other prokaryotic domain, the Archaea, is that they have a unique cell wall, peptidoglycans in the cell wall. Let's go ahead and continue looking at some major clades or groups within the domain Eubacteria. So the next one I would like to discuss would be the Rickettsia bacteria. And there's actually a genus which is Rickettsia as well. And the rickettsial bacteria are very small, among the smallest of the bacteria. They have a very small genome, a small chromosome, and all members of the Rickettsia are obligate intracellular parasites. So they actually have to live within other cells. They really can't live out on their own. And so these are pathogens. They cause disease. And so in the Yellowstone ecosystem, again, they're not a major problem, but they do cause a disease known as Rocky Mountain spotted fever. And kind of ironically, Rocky Mountain spotted fever is not that common in the Rocky Mountain chain, although it was first discovered there. So Rickettsia is another tick-borne disease, causes kind of a severe fever. It's not really as problematic, in my view, as Lyme's disease. But it is something that shows up in low numbers in the Rocky Mountains. It's actually a bigger problem in the east, but again, originally took its name from the Rocky Mountain area. So there are a few cases per year in the Wyoming area. Now, one that is problematic, or another clade or group which is problematic in the Yellowstone ecosystem, is the clade kingdom of the chlamydia, the chlamydias. The chlamydias are another group of very small bacteria, small genome, and they are also obligate intracellular parasites. So again, these are pathogenic bacteria. And certainly they're responsible for sexually transmitted disease in humans, but they have been a problem in the Yellowstone ecosystem because they can cause a form of pink eye. And so the genus Chlamydia, within this larger group Chlamydia, again, small intracellular parasites. And its big problem in the Yellowstone ecosystem is that this pink eye infection was really a problem for the Rocky Mountain bighorn sheep in the Yellowstone ecosystem. And back in the mid-1980s, there was a major epidemic of chlamydia, this pink eye infection, and reduced the population of the bighorn sheep by about 60%. And they've never really recovered from that. So there have been other pathogens that have basically kind of kept them down. They do have some problems with getting enough nutrients in the ecosystem. And so it's been a problem, a recurring problem for this population. They just can't get back to their historic numbers, certainly, and even the mid-1980s numbers. Now, a contributor to this problem is another group or clade or kingdom, if you like, of the Eubacteria, which are the mycoplasmas. And when you see that suffix plasma on a Eubacterian and even Archaeans, what that's telling us is that they actually lack a cell wall. And so you might say, well, I thought bacteria had unique cell walls. Well, they do, but in this case, we think they evolved from bacteria that had cell walls, even though they themselves lack a cell wall. But the mycoplasmas, again, very, very small, one of the smallest genomes in nature among the Eubacterians and other prokaryotes, and also obligate intracellular parasites, so they cause disease. And the main problem here in the Yellowstone ecosystem with mycoplasma is that they cause a form of pneumonia. So this has been another problem for the bighorn sheep population primarily. So again, they were knocked down by that chlamydia infection, and which caused pink eye, and then they have had recurring problems with pneumonia. So between the chlamydia and the mycoplasma, they just can't get back to the original numbers. Now, another fairly abundant bacterium in the Yellowstone ecosystem are the cyanobacteria. And the common name for the cyanobacteria are the blue-green algae, although they're not true algae. We'll talk about algae a little bit later. But again, another major group of eubacterians. Cyanobacteria are normally found in filaments. There are some unicellular forms, but they're mostly multicellular types, so they form these long filaments. This is an example, oscillatoria. Another view of that, and still another filamentous cyanobacterium. And the cells of the cyanobacteria have lots of photosynthetic membranes. So they're just loaded with an abundance of membranes. And these membranes contain photosynthetic pigments which can absorb light energy. And the cyanobacteria are important because they practice plant-like photosynthesis. In fact, members of the cyanobacteria are ancestral to the chloroplasts that we find in the true plants, within plant cells. So again, cyanobacteria are an important group evolutionarily, historically, and also in the Yellowstone ecosystem because they are photosynthetic. And so again, practicing plant-like photosynthesis, they're going to combine carbon dioxide and water and form sugars, glucose, and release oxygen. And they require the pigment chlorophyll A to initiate this process of photosynthesis. So again, kind of classic plant-like photosynthesis. Now, when we look at photosynthesis, there are light-absorbing pigments. The one that is absolutely required is chlorophyll A. And in addition to that, there are typically other light-absorbing pigments, and there are a number of these, and within the cyanobacteria, one group of these accessory pigments are called carotenoids. So the idea behind an accessory pigment is that it is not absolutely required for photosynthesis, but it aids in photosynthesis. So again, what these accessory pigments do can help expand beyond kind of the normal ranges of absorption that you might see in some plants and can allow for more efficient absorption of light, absorbing more light than perhaps other types of organisms can. And also this results in some cases of pigmentation of the cyanobacteria, so they can have some various different pigments. Now, one of the places that we see the cyanobacteria in the Yellowstone ecosystem are in the hot springs. So you can see that they prefer temperatures in the 113 degree Fahrenheit range to 167 degrees Fahrenheit. And to put that in perspective, keep in mind that the boiling temperature of water is 212 degrees Fahrenheit. So they can tolerate some pretty hot conditions. They also tend to like slightly basic or alkaline pHs. Now, so again, they like hot, slightly alkaline hot springs. So places where we find the cyanobacteria include the Mammoth area, the geyser basins, the upper, middle, and lower geyser basins, and then also the West Thumb area are places where you can observe cyanobacteria in the hot springs. And when you see a cyanobacteria, there can be a range of colors, and there are other microorganisms that can also have these colors, but typical colors for the cyanobacteria in the hot springs would be orange, also can be yellow, bluish green, and again, that's kind of where the group gets its name. This is very frequent. They're also called the blue-green algae. And then occasionally black. And again, unfortunately, they're not the only one that can be that, but an indicator that you're looking at blue-green algae or cyanobacteria. So again, when we look at the hot springs, some of the coloration that we see in hot springs is due to the minerals that we see in the water, but a lot of the coloration that we see, at least along the bottoms and sides, are due to the organisms here. So again, when you see the oranges and yellows, that's pretty typically cyanobacteria. And they form these bacterial mats. And in this case, they're a photosynthetic bacterium. Now, also, the cyanobacteria are important because they are capable of fixing nitrogen. And nitrogen fixation is an important part of an ecosystem because nitrogen is a limiting factor for plants and other autotrophs in the ecosystem. There may be plenty of sunshine, there may be plenty of carbon dioxide, there may be plenty of water, but you need other materials as well if you want to grow. And so one of those limiting nutrients is nitrogen. And so we'll come back to this when we talk about some other types of bacteria, but what they're capable of doing is taking atmospheric nitrogen, which is really not a very useful form of nitrogen. Nitrogen makes up, or nitrogen gas, I should say, makes up about 80% of the air that we breathe. It's inert, it's not very reactive. And so what the cyanobacteria can do is that they can quote unquote fix nitrogen. In other words, they convert it into something called ammonia or ammonium. And this is a useful form of nitrogen. This is something that a plant can absorb. This is something that the cyanobacteria themselves can utilize and then incorporate that into, say, amino acids in making proteins and other uses as well. So again, we need nitrogen to grow, primarily for amino acids and proteins, although other things as well. And this conversion of atmospheric nitrogen to ammonium is a really critical skill in the ecosystems, and the cyanobacteria are capable of this. So they have specialized cells that are capable of carrying out this nitrogen fixation, and those cells are called heterocytes. So heterocytes will be the nitrogen fixing cells, and then the other cells will be carrying out photosynthesis. Now, another group clade kingdom of Eubacteria are the thermophilic bacteria. And what those words are trying to tell us, thermo means heat, philic means to love. So these are the heat-loving eubacterians. And so again, we would associate thermophilic bacteria with hot springs throughout the ecosystem. And we have some different types of thermophilic bacteria. Some of them are photoautotrophs. So they don't necessarily practice a plant-like photosynthesis, but they do use light to produce organic molecules. And the most famous member of this group of thermophilic bacteria is Thermus aquaticus, and it was actually harvested from hot springs in Yellowstone Park. And this bacterium yields a type of DNA polymerase known as Taq polymerase. And Taq polymerase plays a role in a process known as PCR. And we'll talk about PCR later in the course. But anyway, people have made millions of dollars off of this Taq polymerase. Taq polymerase is a type of DNA polymerase that can function at high temperatures. And so so the National Park Service is kind of defensive about this now. They are actually licensed people to go in, and if people are looking at some of these hot springs and the organisms there, because there's potential value in the enzymes and chemicals that are found in some of the organisms that live in the hot springs. So now there's actually licensing agreements with the park system and biologists who come in that if they do produce something valuable from that the Park Service will get a cut of the profits. So again, that's something that we'll talk about later in the course. But there is also chemoautotrophs that belong to these thermophilic bacteria as well. And so they'll be carrying out inorganic chemical reactions using the energy from those to construct organic molecules. So these are important parts of the food chain, both the cyanobacteria and these autotrophic thermophilic bacteria. So other organisms will feed on them. So these thermophilic bacteria, as you can see, like it from around 140 degrees Fahrenheit to 160 degrees Fahrenheit. So again, pretty hot. Also like it fairly alkaline. So there's some overlap here between the habitats of the thermophilic bacteria and the cyanobacteria. And we tend to find them in some of the same areas. So we'll find them in the Mammoth area. We'll find them in the geyser basins, the upper, middle, and lower geyser basin. We also find them in West Thumb. And also you'll find these bacteria in the Norris geyser basin as well. And again, they will have photosynthetic pigments or other pigments. And so some of the colors we see here would be pink, yellow, orange, black, as well as white. So some of the chemoautotrophs may be metabolizing iron or sulfur, and so they can be kind of black or white based on what they're metabolizing. And so again, we will associate these with hot springs, and depending where we are in the park and the colors that we see, we can associate those with thermophilic bacteria. Now, three other groups that I want to consider together all involve nitrogen and the cycling of nitrogen in ecosystems. So there is a separate clade or kingdom that are the nitrogen-fixing bacteria. There's also a group which are the nitrifying bacteria, and then still another group which are the denitrifying bacteria. And these are eubacterians that we find living in the soil, again, throughout ecosystems in general, but the Yellowstone ecosystem as well. And so again, these organisms play a role in nitrogen cycling. And so just as the cyanobacteria can fix nitrogen, also the nitrogen-fixing bacteria can do that as well. And so they will take atmospheric nitrogen, which again I've mentioned is not very useful to organisms. They'll convert that to ammonia and ammonium. And this can be absorbed directly by plants and utilized by plants, but also we have the nitrifying bacteria which can convert ammonia to nitrate, NO3. And nitrate is also a very useful form of nitrogen, can be directly incorporated into a variety of important organic molecules. And so nitrates can be absorbed by the plants and utilized by the plants. So nitrogen-fixing bacteria and the nitrifying bacteria then are taking atmospheric nitrogen out of the air and getting that into the food chain. And then once those nitrogen compounds are in the plants, they can be eaten by animals and work their way through the food chain. But if that was the only aspect of nitrogen cycling, then over time what would happen is that nitrogen concentrations in the atmosphere would become less and less and less, and it would have all been used up a long time ago. So there are also other soil bacteria, which are called denitrifying bacteria. They can take the nitrates and regenerate atmospheric nitrogen from that. So again, these would be chemoautotrophs that are carrying out this pathway. And so the denitrifying bacteria end up regenerating nitrogen, atmospheric nitrogen, back into the air that we breathe. And then again, that continues to cycle. So again, these three groups work to start with nitrogen gas, go to ammonia, ammonium, nitrates, which can be absorbed by plants, and then also the denitrifying bacteria can take these nitrates and regenerate atmospheric nitrogen from those. So that maintains the concentrations of nitrogen in the atmosphere. And some of the nitrogen-fixing bacteria actually associate with plants. They have symbiotic relationships, mutualistic relationships with plants. And the legumes in particular, the members of the P and B family, they actually form nodules within which the nitrogen-fixing bacteria will live. And so the nitrogen-fixing bacteria will actually fix nitrogen not just for themselves, but enough that the plant that houses them benefits from that. And then these bacteria benefit from the fact that the plant is producing sugars, and they'll feed on the sugars that the plant is producing. So since they're both benefiting from the relationship, we call this a mutualistic symbiotic relationship. So that then brings us to our other prokaryotic domain. So our other prokaryotic domain would be the Archaea. And you may recall, again, that they have all the characteristics of prokaryotes. But what distinguishes them from the Eubacteria is that they have unique plasma membranes. They have unique phospholipids in their plasma membranes. Now, looking at the Archaea and some major kingdoms, if you will, or major clades or groups of Archaeans, one of these would be the extreme halophiles. And the extreme halophiles are salt-loving bacteria. And we don't necessarily find a lot of these in the Yellowstone ecosystem, but we do find them near the Yellowstone ecosystem. So there are extreme halophiles, for example, that live in the Great Salt Lake in Utah, which is fairly close to the Yellowstone ecosystem. Another group of Archaeans are the hyperthermophiles. And so what that's trying to tell us is they love it hot, but they love it really hot. So the hyperthermophiles we again find throughout the Yellowstone ecosystem in the geothermal features. So you'll find them in virtually all of the basins, thermal basins throughout the Yellowstone ecosystem. And as you can see, they like it up to 194 degrees Fahrenheit. They can usually tolerate anything less than 194 degrees. And again, that is hot. 212 degrees Fahrenheit is boiling, so they can really tolerate super high temperatures. They generally like acidic pHs, so they differ from some of the other thermophiles we've talked about before. And also they're generally colorless, which also would make them hard to identify just by looking with the naked eye. And then the last major group of Archaeans are the methanogens. And so the methanogens are methane-producing Archaeans. And under anaerobic conditions, anoxic conditions, without oxygen, they will enter a metabolic pathway that yields methane gas. And so we find them living in various places. As we look at the methanogens, some of them are thermophiles, so we do have some methanogens living in the hot springs throughout the park. Many of them live in wetlands. There's a lot of peat kind of just below the surface throughout the Yellowstone ecosystem, and we find a lot of methanogens there, and so they will, as they metabolize, they'll produce methane. Also within the gut of almost all organisms, there are methanogens living. And so what they will do is any of the food that the animal is not capable of digesting, they will try to digest that. Also, it's an anaerobic condition down in the gut, so they'll benefit from that. And then another place, although we don't really have landfills in the Yellowstone ecosystem, globally they're significant because they do live in landfills. There's anaerobic conditions there. And so again, they produce a lot of methane gas. And so this is something that we'll come back to when we talk about global warming, but these methanogens are problematic because they do produce a lot of methane, and as the earth warms and as many of the Arctic regions in particular begin to thaw the permafrost, the methanogens there potentially can produce incredible amounts of methane, which will continue to warm the earth. So we're concerned about this positive feedback loop, but that's something we'll get to later in the semester. And there are other groups of Archaea. I don't want you to have you or think that these are the only types of Archaeans, or with the Eubacterians, we've talked about that these are the only types of Eubacterians. We've just talked about some groups that are relevant to the Yellowstone ecosystem. Okay, so that brings us then to the Eukarya. And so eukaryans, of course, are eukaryotic. They're big. They'll have all of the characteristics of eukaryotic cells. So we're going to be looking at a variety of different organelles and so on. And when we talk about members of the Eukarya, there's a term that we can use with some of them. So when we talk about domain Eukarya, I'll be initially here talking about protists. Now, the term protist is not an actual clade or group. It's just kind of a common name to describe certain types of eukaryotes. And the type of eukaryotes that I'm describing, if I use the word protist, or if you hear the word protist, is it's describing unicellular eukaryotes. And unicellular eukaryotes are one-celled organisms, so things like an amoeba would be a unicellular eukaryote. It could also be what we consider colonial eukaryotes. Colonial eukaryotes would be organisms that are unicellular that can associate in a group or can dissociate and live individually. So colonial specimens can either form a temporary alliance or they can separate and live on their own. And also we will consider some multicellular eukaryotes as protists if they lack tissues. And so tissues would be groups of specialized cells. So if an organism lacks tissues, true tissues, cells that have some specific function, then we could also consider them protists if they lack those. And so we won't be talking a lot about multicellular algae, for example, in the Yellowstone ecosystem, but an example would be in marine ecosystems, the coastal kelps. So when you look at some of these kelps, they're multicellular. They have to have, they're many-celled, these cells have to live together. But if you look at the cells from the blade or from the stipe or what we call the holdfast, the cells basically all look alike and they're doing more or less the same function. So we don't have strong tissue specialization here. Okay, now, also some different types of protists. So again, a protist would be unicellular, colonial, or multicellular organism that lacks tissues. Now, among the protists, again, there's some other descriptive terms that we use when we're talking about some of these eukaryotic organisms. And one is we describe some of these organisms as protozoa. And so these are the animal-like protists. And so that basically means that they're heterotrophic. So the heterotrophic protists we generally refer to as protozoans. A ciliate would be a protist that has cilia, and we'll look at some examples later, but cilia are small hair-like structures, you may recall, and as those beat back and forth, that'll propel the organism through water, in some cases body fluids. So a ciliate is any organism that has cilia. The term flagellate refers to any of the protists that have flagellae, and so you may recall that the flagellae are whip-like structures that can help organisms move through fluids. And amoebas. Amoebas would be another type of protist. Amoebas essentially have a malleable shape. They can constantly change shape and they crawl over surfaces as opposed to swimming through fluids. And we'll look at examples in a little while. And then also the term algae is just kind of a generic term for any protist that is photosynthetic. So a photosynthetic protist we refer to as an algae. And again, that could be a unicellular algae. It could be a colonial algae. It could be a multicellular algae. But the point is that they're photosynthetic. All right, so as we get into the actual classification then, within the domain Eukarya, there are 4 superkingdoms within the domain Eukarya. The first is the Excavata, and we'll start off talking about those in a minute here. Another is the SAR, and SAR is an abbreviation for the Stromanopila, Alveola, and Rhizaria. And we don't need to really remember all of those terms, but the Stromanopila is trying to tell us that they have certain types of flagellae. Rhizaria is trying to tell us that they are amoebas. And the alveolate is telling us that they have indentations in their cell membrane. And I'll get back to that in a minute. Also the Plantae, which would be photosynthetic and have true tissues. And then the Uniconta, which includes animals and fungi. And when they have flagellae, they'll have a single flagellae. That's more or less what distinguishes that group among other characteristics, but we'll get back to that later. So first looking at the superkingdom Excavata. So what makes an excavate an excavate? So the Excavata have or lack mitochondria, or certainly lack a traditional mitochondria. mitochondria that are similar to the mitochondria we find in other organisms. And among this group, many of them are pathogens as well. So many of these are obligate parasites, have to be a parasite to survive. So members of this group tend to be really, really small. Since they lack mitochondria, they cannot process energy very well, so they tend to have to live in other organisms to survive. And in the Yellowstone ecosystem, within the superkingdom Excavata, we're going to be concerned with the kingdom Diplomonida. And members of the Diplomonida, again, lack mitochondria. And the most famous member of this group is in the genus Giardia. So Giardia is kind of notorious in the Yellowstone ecosystem. Again, Giardia are very, very small. They tend to be obligate parasites. And they cause a very severe diarrhea in humans. And you normally find them in the intestinal tract, but they can move up into the liver and cause problems with the liver as well. But other organisms carry Giardia besides humans. So certainly fecal contamination, human fecal contamination gets into the water. This is what, and then that water is drunk by the next person. That's how it's transmitted. But Giardia is also endemic in most of the mammals in the ecosystem. Particularly, they usually point out the beaver, also muskrat in particular, but even ungulates can carry Giardia, but mostly beaver and muskrat. And so the Giardia has an active phase, a flagellated form called the trophozoite that you're looking at here. And so this will, burrow into the intestinal lining. And again, it causes a very severe diarrhea, very painful diarrhea. And being a eukaryotic organism, the eukaryotic infections are just harder to get rid of than a bacterial infection because we're eukaryotic cells as well. So if we're going to kill eukaryote in our gut, it potentially the medicine could make us sick as well. So again, there's this active phase, which is actually the disease-causing form of the Giardia. But also the Giardia organism can encyst as well. And so as we look at this micrograph, these are some of the cysts of the Giardia. And so again, they'll go into this inactive state. And so it's usually these cysts then that get passed in the feces. They can live for quite a while outside the body. Then when the cyst is ingested, and this is much like a spore, when the cyst is ingested, we digest away the outer layer that they've produced, and then they break out of the cyst and then trigger disease in the next host. So as I mentioned earlier with some of the bacteria like the enteric bacteria, E. coli, that's always a risk when you go to the Yellowstone ecosystem. When you're up there, you've got to treat the water. So if you're going into the backcountry, even if you're out just for a day hike, you either need to have a high quality filter that will specifically eliminate Giardia and bacteria, boil the water, or treat it with iodine. Okay, that does it for today. I'll see you next time.